All right. Welcome to Immersed. This is a VR program I'm using in the Meta Quest, and I'm going to be going over this poster on super performance, sampling planning, and ecological information. This is by Bradley Alisea, myself, and Ankit Grover. I did the theory and modeling and the conception of the work, and Ankit provided machine learning, deep learning, and Gibsonian information insights. And we're from the Orthogonal Research and Education Laboratory. So if we start at the upper left-hand side of this poster, we see that there's a simple question that we're trying to address, and that is, how does a human catch a fly? More generally, how does a fly avoid its catcher? So how does a fly stay ahead of the human catcher? Why is it so rarely that you can catch a fly in your hand or with a swatter? And so the answer, at least in part, is that the fly has a much higher visual sampling rate. The human has a good planning capacity, but it doesn't match the fly's sampling rate. And there's some coevolutionary selection between agents with these different types of abilities. So in this case, humans and flies didn't co-evolve together in terms of being able to catch the fly, but you can have agents where you have this coevolution, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So this is a presentation at the BICA AI conference 2023, and the talk is on our YouTube channel for the lab. So if we look at this graph here, we see kind of where we're going with this. If we think about this human-fly relationship, the human is what we call a super planner. And the fly and the human are both super performers. So the human is what we call a super planner. It means it has a large internal model. It can produce complex plans, and it can make up for the lack of visual sampling rate. And so that's what we call a super planner. A super sampler, on the other hand, is what we refer to as our fly. And so our fly can sample its visual environment at very high sampling rates, and it can stay ahead of the super planner if it has a significantly higher visual sampling rate. If it has a significantly higher sampling rate than the human's ability to plan, or the super planner's ability to plan. In between these two regimes is an optimal trade-off, which is basically where you don't have super performance, but you have like a mix of both. And we see this blue line here, which is a frontier, which means that in biology, at least, we don't see any things that exceed these kind of trade-off limits. So you can either be a super planner or a super sampler or some mix of the two. Now here are these relativistic regime cases. And this is where that trade-off breaks down. And so in the talk, we give a number of examples of technologies that might be in this relativistic regime. We don't know of anything in nature that's in this relativistic regime. So if we look at visual sampling rates, we say that for humans, the visual sampling rate is 16 hertz. In Drosophila, which is the fruit fly, the range of visual sampling goes from 60 to 100 hertz. And in Glossina, which is the tsetse fly, the visual sampling rate goes from 85 to 205 hertz. So it's vastly, by maybe several orders of magnitude, higher in some cases than the human. And so the fly can move faster, it has more access to visual information, and it doesn't require any sort of super planning capabilities. On the other hand, the human has a really extensive internal model for planning. And so it can infer the general direction a fly of any type might take. And so it can catch the fly, perhaps, by matching that rate and concentrating and planning. So down here we talk about a little bit about, in the human case, what would a super sampler, a super planner, and a median sampler look like in terms of information put around the human body, a human torso. And so you're in this virtual world. This world is generated around my torso, and I have visual information all around me. And so you can see the rendered world, and there's detail I can't necessarily pick out in the distance there, those mountains. But I can sort of fill in the gaps with my imagination, with my internal model, and that's what I'm doing to a large extent, to imagine things in this room and the spatial relationships. And so, but you can see that if we had a super sampler, if humans were able to sample their visual environment at a very high rate, you would have a lot of data points, a lot of points where you would have to take in information all at once, and we would present it in that way. Super planner, on the other hand, would only have a few data points. So if this room were a minimal room, it might still be functional as something that I can, kind of imagine that I'm in a cafe in the mountains and so forth. I can use my internal model to fill in the gaps. Median sampler, of course, is this optimal trade-off region, and that's where you have some data points in the cloud, some things that are immediately visible to the eye that the eye can sample, but also you have an internal model that can fill in the gaps. Not as much as a super planner, and not as much visual information sampling as the super sampler. Now, if we think about this in terms of what's going on in machine learning and deep learning, super planning in that paradigm involves this concept of world models and simulating world models. So there's a paper on world models by Ha and Schmidt-Huber that you'll find in the longer talk. And this involves a large internal model size for the agent with a sufficiently high sampling rate. So this internal model allows the agent to have a limited sensory sampling rate, but it will upsample to match the continuity in the world. So that's super planning. Super sampling, however, in this machine learning data learning paradigm, is the training of data-driven models. So as we're familiar with in this paradigm, the more data, the better. Sort of this Norwegian view of AI, where Peter Norvig proposed that all you really need is a huge data set and you can learn anything. And indeed, we're seeing that that's the case to some extent with large language models and other types of models like that. These models have high sampling rates like our super samplers, but they have low levels of aliasing bias. That means they need to downsample to match the continuity in the world. So they need to downsample from their acquisition of data and maybe sort of generalize from these broader trends. And so we can actually look at sampling in terms of a happy medium here, an optimal trade-off. When we have low sampling rates, we end up with a collapsed representation. Sometimes we don't have a representation at all, and it's because we don't have enough information to actually build the representation. So a super sampler may not have much of a representation of the world, although there are some examples of that, and we talk about it in the talk. If you have a high rate of sampling, you also have a collapsed representation. And again, we have an example where we talk about this. This is in insects so actually this low would be at the super planner, the high would be the super sampler. But in the high case, you would also have a collapsed representation because you're not devoting enough of your cognitive capacity to internal models. So you're just relying on the sensory information. For a low, and this wouldn't even be a super planner, actually, it would be somewhere not in this region. It would be somewhere out here, maybe. So this would be where you just sample at a really low rate. You have a collapsed representation of the world, and you really can't interact with the world much. So you really can't interact with the world much. However, in the middle, you have the medium, or the hyper-realistic representation. And this is this happy medium, this optimal trade-off region here. So this is our sampling regime. And so you can also model this as borrowing from the Yerkes-Dodson model of arousal. You can borrow this idea of an inverted U. So in the Yerkes-Dodson model, you have one point on the left-hand side, which is low amounts of arousal. And for low amounts of arousal, agents are usually disengaged from their activities. If you don't have arousal, you fall asleep, your mind might wander. If you're involved in a task with moderate amounts of arousal, you're attentive, and you can maintain that arousal optimally. Whatever that means is up to the task and the individual. Then you have a low point on the right hand side, which involves high amounts of arousal. This is when you're very excitable or when you're very irritated, and that's when you can be distracted by things. And so we don't really want people to be on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. That's why we have the sort of French flag model where we have the blue part for low amounts of arousal, the red part for high amounts of arousal. We want people in this white area, this moderate amount of arousal. So this is something we can measure through looking at the physiology of arousal in the Yerkes-Dodson model. But if we think about this in terms of augmented perception, we can take this model of human perception in a volume like this virtual environment, and we can look at what it takes to move them to this optimal state. So sometimes if we have too much information in the environment, a lot of stuff to sample, then we can take this, we have these agents here, we can move them sort of from, one point to another. So if we have a lot of information in the environment, we can move it back to less information in the environment, and we can reach this optimal point. The same thing holds true if we have very little information in this environment. We can add information and bring them back to that optimal point. And so there's some point in this environment where there's the optimal amount of stimuli that I can interact with. There's just an optimal amount of detail. If there's too much detail, maybe it's taxing. Maybe if there's too little detail, I can't make out what it's supposed to be. So that's what this is arguing. And you can actually have a strategy for enforcing that optimal state. So another thing we are concerned with is this idea of information aliasing. So you have these sine waves which represent environmental information, and these little bars that represent sampling of that information. So the width of these bars really tells us how much information we get in every sample, and the amount of bars across tell us how much of that sine wave we're actually sampling. So we can define a super sampling rate, which are these very thin bars. So it's really finely sampled, like a signal. We have a normal sampling rate of C, and then maybe something where we have the Nyquist value for this signal, which is the optimal level. So we have these different types of sampling strategies. The farther away we get from the Nyquist frequency is where we get aliasing, we get undersampling, and so forth. Panel B demonstrates information moments. And so these are information moments M1, M2, M3, and M4. And they represent how much of the sine wave you need to sample in a single sample. So sometimes your agents will sample, say, like half a sine wave. Sometimes they'll only sample the peaks of the sine wave, the peak amplitudes, net positive and negative. Sometimes they'll just sample moments of the sine wave. And so this is what we call information moments. So these are portions of a signal where the sampling rate might become more fine or coarse grained. So these are units of sampling, and they control acquisition because the wider this window, the more information you get, but the narrower the window, the finer information you get. And so, there can be multiple strategies in a single agent to do this. That leads us to coevolutionary superperformance. So if we had a human and an insect, and they were co-evolved to sort of chase each other, or the human was co-evolved with the fly to swat it, then we might actually see some sort of the human gain some ability to swat flies better, or the fly to evade humans even better than they can now. And so, they're generally mismatched coevolutionarily now, but they could have this sort of pursuit evasion game. They could engage in this pursuit evasion game and optimize the response to the other. So in this case, we have two agents. They're nondescript computational agents. One, which is the emitter, produces a pattern, and then the other, the receiver, tries to interpret that pattern, tries to figure out what the pattern is. And so if it can match the pattern, it's caught the emitter. If the emitter produces a pattern that's very cryptic and the receiver cannot figure it out, then the emitter has evaded the receiver. So that's how it works. And so, we can have this, set this up in different ways to have some sort of, look at some set of relationships. So on this side of the poster, we kind of propose, actually in the talk, we propose a couple of strategies which are shown in this. And this is where we have different relationships between emitters and receivers. So this is a super planner that pursues that M1 strategy from the information moments section. This receiver pursues this emitter, which is also a super sampler, or this is a super planner, this is a super sampler. They pursue strategies M2, M3, and M4. So they pursue all of these strategies in congruence, and they can probably evade the super planner, although maybe not. Their strategies don't match, but they can maybe do it. The median sampler is maybe a better match for this super sampler. This median sampler pursues strategies M2 and M3. This super sampler pursues strategies M2, M3, and M4. And so they can maybe catch this emitter more easily. This example is a relativistic example of pursuing all of the four strategies, but also it's good at planning and at sampling its environment. So it's probably not going to be able to be caught, and so on and so forth. So if we go through this algorithm, this is in the archive paper, not in the conference paper. It's laid out in more detail. It's also talked about in the longer talk for the conference. So this is where we initialize our agent. We have X emitters and Y receivers. Then we provide distributions for the emitter and then distributions for the receiver, so they get these this ensemble of information moments. And there's an isomorphic mapping of each agent's spatial representation, but they're sampling information differently about the environment. So in that case, it would be like in this room, we would be able to sample that plant in different sort of orientations or different features of the plant. Sometimes if we pursue the same sampling strategy, we can both see the plant in the same way, but otherwise we might not. And so this is kind of what we're doing here. There's a fitness threshold, so if the evasion or prediction criterion are crossed, that fitness threshold is crossed, then we have this, uh, we can, these can survive to another generation. So there's a fitness threshold that's involved here. Successful evasion is where the lag between baseline sampling rate and the increased sampling rate is matched, basically. So this is where successful evasion, this agent here with the black circle around it, is able to successfully evade the receivers. These receivers and these emitters are both locked in a sort of a pursuit evasion until there's a successful evasion, or until there's a successful prediction, which is down here, and that's where catches up and catches it. So that's the sort of the algorithm. Go to the archive paper for more information on that. Finally, there's a role for Gibsonian information here, and this is where we have this idea of direct perception, informing an internal communication channel, which is this internal model. And so we have this information coming in. This is what the super sampler is operating on. The super performer is taking that information and creating an internal communication channel. The acquisition of information coming in is less than in the super sampler, but it's able to do more things in the internal communication channel. And so we talked about Gibsonian information back in 2021 at the BICA AI conference then. And so that is in their proceedings if you want to read more about it. We're also working on a larger paper on Gibsonian information, so stay tuned for that. So this, there are a lot of things here. The structure of the internal communication channel involves a lot of things. It involves collective motion, maximum flow rate, singular movement, and then something called a sensorium, which is multi-sensory integration. So we have all these different parts of the internal communication channel that can aid a super planner, and it connects with sampling. So in the relativistic regime, which you see up here, a super or relativistic performer might be able to do very well, collects sampling collective motion, dealing with the information flow rate, and then but also can plan for some of these other things. So it would have a very strong internal model, and it could sample at a very high rate of environmental information and encode it properly.